G'day, eh? My name's RJ. This is Killer Canuck, and together, we're looking through Canada's horror history. In the early 1970s, writer Alan Ormsby was approached by his friend Bob Clark, whom he'd met while the two were together in the drama department at the University of Miami. Clark brought to him some money to produce a horror movie. Ormsby recalled that his brother had just mentioned to him a movie he'd seen at the theaters. A zombie movie. Released in 1968, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead would influence the horror landscape almost immediately, and this collaboration was to be a prime example. The two got to work writing what would become the film Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. Much of the cast and crew was made up of friends and people they knew. One of those people was Carl Zutrair, the composer. Zutrair composed the accompanying music for plays at the high school that both he and Clark attended. He had since been given an opportunity to compose the music for a Canadian documentary, bringing with him a 35mm print of Children to use as a resume. The Canadian company, called Quadrant, loved it and asked if Clark was available with another script. Bob Clark brought the news to Ormsby, who quickly pumped out a script that he titled The Veteran. This title wouldn't stick, and neither would many of the subsequent titles for that matter. Quadrant loved it, and they agreed to produce the film for 5 times the budget of that of Children. They brought back many of the same cast and crew from their previous endeavor. Clark left the screenplay entirely up to Ormsby and changed nothing, shooting what was essentially the first draft of the script and without any interference from the producers. The film plays out as a strong anti-Vietnam War allegory, ambitious and risque at the time of its release in 1974. Ormsby had gone to high school with people who sadly died during the war, and both he and Clark were strong advocates against it. The script takes some cues from W.W. Jacobs' The Monkey's Paw, as well as some influence from the play Bury the Dead by Irwin Shaw, and Bertolt Brecht's poem The Ballad of the Dead Soldier. Death Dream, or Dead of Night, or The Night Walk, or The Veteran, or The Night Andy Came Home, opens in a nondescript jungle during a battle. 2 soldiers, Andy Brooks and Darren Wilson, are shot and killed. Interesting to note here is that in this scene, and only this scene, Andy is played by a different actor, Gary Swanson, as this scene was shot prior to actor Richard Backus's casting. I'm hard-pressed to think of a movie where not only is the main character played by a different actor for a full scene, but one where the main character is played by a different actor the very first time you see them. Back in not Vietnam, unofficially, the Brooks family sits around the dinner table enjoying a roast, where Mother Christine, played by Lynn Carlin, offers up some sound parental advice.
Kathy, don't ever marry a man who can't carve a roast beef or a turkey.
They are visited solemnly by military Captain George, who delivers a telegram with the news of their son's demise. Stopping off for a double-double and a pack of darts, a truck driver tells the diner owners that he picked up a hitchhiker, a soldier, on his way.
There's a ride.
Ours.
Good. I thought we were being invaded.
We get just enough time to notice the Attention All Veterans poster decidedly on the register before he returns to his truck. Brooks' patriarch Charles, played by John Morley, awakes, without his prize horse's head ruining his sheets and mood, to the sound of the family dog Butch making noise downstairs. He heads downstairs and lets the dog out through the front door, and when he closes it he reveals Andy standing silently in the corner. This is something that I would likely refer to as a red flag, but it seems to be just me, as the rest of the family has come downstairs to welcome Andy back home happily. But it soon becomes apparent that Andy is not entirely himself.
Pretty rough over there, eh, son?
Over where?
Charles explains to Andy that the military told them that he had died overseas.
They actually said that my son was dead.
I was.
Oh.
The next morning, the body of the truck driver is found by a police officer played by Bob Clark in a cameo. The body is brought to Dr. Philip Allman, played by As the World Turns alumni Henderson Forsyth, for an autopsy. They find a needle mark in the victim's arm as Bob Clark gets a little overeager with the investigation. The body of the truck driver here is actually not that of first actor David Golakowski. It's instead Michael McGowan, son of Jack McGowan, DP on this film, as well as Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. Michael would follow in his father's footsteps and work consistently through the 80s and 90s as a cam op and Steadicam operator. Charles, Andy, and sister Catherine sit in the backyard enjoying the sun and some egg salad sandwiches. They are visited by their chatty mailman who blabs on and on with what Bob Clark referred to as Ormsby humor.
You know what it was? Some crowd shot him in the ass.
He asks Andy, who has thus far remained silent, about Darren Wilson, to which Andy aggressively stands and walks back into the house. That evening, Andy sits upstairs in his rocking chair, full of confidence that no one is going to wrap a plastic bag around his head. The incessant rocking has started to get on the nerves of his father, who is trying to watch his Canadian news.
Police spokesman refused to speculate about the significance of these wounds.
The dysfunction of the Brooks family starts to bleed through as Charles and Christine argue over parenting methods and generational differences.
Well, I went through it too, but when I came back, I didn't act like
Well,
that.
you're not Andy.
John Marley and Lynn Carlin played a similar miserable couple in John Cassavetes' Faces a few years prior in 1968. The two were at each other during the entire production, with Marley reportedly claiming that Carlin couldn't act. This certainly helped the performances as, ironically, Carlin was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. Andy comes downstairs and leaves, but not before catching some words from Butchie. We follow Andy through a segment that Alan Ormsby titled The Night Walk in his script, which is where one of the titles originates from. Though edited down heavily in the final product, Andy was to visit a number of places he used to frequent prior to being shipped off to war, places like his old school, for instance. Instead, Andy sneaks a peek through the window of his old girlfriend, Joanne, before heading to the cemetery. He kneels down in front of a tombstone and begins to write. In an attempt to lighten Andy's mood, Charles invites a Sandlot equivalent over to chat with him. They ask him about the war and other invasive things.
Hey Andy, you see a lot of action over there? Kill any guys?
Before one boy offers to teach Andy how to protect himself. He takes exception to this demonstration, and in a notorious scene that would make modern rating boards sweat, grabs the child's wrist and throws him to the ground. When Butchie tries to stand up for the kid, Andy picks him up with one hand and chokes him in front of the rest of the children. Butchie was wearing a specialty harness that allowed actor Richard Backus to hold him in the air without actually harming the dog. He recalls that Butchie was happily panting and smiling back at him while he was supposed to be getting choked. Impressive considering that animal handler Bill Burgess had only picked up Butchie from the pound 3 weeks prior to shooting. This boy in the black hat is Ethan Ormsby, son of writer Alan Ormsby. He would grow up and work as a compositor and digital artist in the early aughts on films like Wes Craven's Cursed and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, before sadly passing away from cancer in 2008, at the far too young age of 40. Following this brutal display, Charles takes himself to the local tavern, yes the tavern, to drink away his feelings. He is tended to by assistant director Jeff Gillen in another cameo. Jeff Gillen had a role in Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, and would co-direct Deranged with Alan Ormsby immediately following Deathdream. Most people will remember him, however, as the Santa Claus that tells Ralphie that he'll shoot his eye out with a Red Ryder BB gun. Charles is visited by Dr. Allman, who brings him home and chats with Andy. He tells Andy that he'll give him a checkup free of charge. I think this lighting might have been provided free of charge. The doc asks how Andy got home, and his hitchhiking response gets the gears upstairs turning. He leaves the room with Charles, but not before we get a shot of that sweet Scooby-Doo light switch. He tells Charles that he has to report Andy to the police because the evidence is too, well, evident. Charles asks Dr. Ullman to give him one night before he goes to them, which he accepts. The stress is starting to get to the drunk Charles, and he takes it out on the family.
Daddy, what's the matter?
Well, mind your own goddamn business.
Dr. Ullman returns to his office and heads straight to the telephone. We get a brief stalking sequence accompanied by an outlandish score, before Ullman opens the door to reveal Andy, whose body is starting to deteriorate.
I came for my checkup.
Andy gets Dr. Ullman to check his pulse and his heartbeat. The doc is baffled to find none evident, and we learn Andy's true intentions when he attacks.
I died for you, Doc. Why shouldn't you return the favor?
There's a brief struggle before Andy stabs Dr. Ullman several times with a large hypodermic needle, killing him brutally. This scene was initially scripted to be intercut with shots of a deer, though the budget allowed for neither the time and expertise it took to get said footage, nor the stock footage of one. Next, Andy uses the same tool to extract some blood from the doctor's body. This is actually Alan Ormsby's arm on the punch-in, and with some stark symbolism, injects the blood straight into his own arm. The next morning, Andy is looking more like himself, and he is happily greeted by his mother and sister. Andy's sister Kathy is played by Anya LaFay, credited here as Anya Ormsby, as she was married to writer Alan Ormsby at the time. This part was written specifically with her in mind. Kathy springs Andy with plans to go on a double date that night, him and Joanne, and her and her boyfriend Bob, like they used to before Andy went away. Charles goes to visit Dr. Ullman but is met with a crowd of people in an ambulance. Alan Ormsby himself, in yet another cameo, says that he ain't no movie star, but he can get behind anything. Yeah, he can get behind anything, and tells Charles that somebody murdered the doc. He says that they think it's the same person who killed the truck driver, the soldier, because of the needle mark on the body. In a panic, Charles leaves. While preparing for his hot date, Andy's eyes and hand have once again begun to deteriorate, but Bob, Kathy, and Joanne have arrived, chirps at the ready.
Do I look all right?
You look terrible.
Special effects makeup was done by Alan Ormsby, who was on set every day. Before shooting began, art director Forrest Carpenter happened to meet a young man at a coffee shop and mentioned to him that he was shooting a movie. The young man responded emphatically that he had a passion for special effects makeup and ran to his car to get his portfolio. Based on Carpenter's recommendation, he would become Alan Ormsby's assistant, and Deathdream would be the first film of legendary effects artist Tom Savini's career. Tom was very enthusiastic on set and eager to work and learn. He took dozens of photographs, as he was an actual Vietnam War photographer, and he and Ormsby got along well. They both had fallen in love with special effects and makeup thanks to the same person, the man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney. He is credited on Deathdream simply as makeup. Savini would continue on, along with most of the crew, to take the makeup and effects helm on Deranged, which was co-directed by Ormsby and Jeff Gillen and produced by Bob Clark. Andy makes his entrance in his sweet white turtleneck and black leather gloves. Despite some hesitance from his former friends,
Everything's fine, Bob.
they head out. Meanwhile, Charles has gone to the police station in hopes that he can lead the officers off the trail of his son. What the hell is that guy doing?
Don, what the hell are you doing?
Seriously. He gives the officers some false information in order to buy some time. Christine has since seen a news report on the murder of Dr. Ullman and has come to the same conclusion that Charles has. Charles returns home asking where Andy is gone, and Christine feeds some false information of her own. He arms himself with Chekhov's gun and heads out to try to find Andy. The pair of couples are about to take in a Death in Space and the Space Knots double bill. This scene was shot at an actual drive-in theater near Brooksville, Florida, and they matted in the movie that was playing as they drove in. Sadly, the drive-in isn't around anymore, suffering much the same fate as thousands across the world in the past 30 years. Bob and Kathy leave to go to the lobby, to get themselves a treat. Andy has a hard time keeping it together, so to speak, and starts to attack Joanne. She strips the glasses from his face to reveal his grotesque, decomposing mug. These contact lenses were specially ordered and were about the size of a quarter. They cut off oxygen to the eyes, and so were only put in immediately preceding a take. Before he can extract any blood from her, however, Bob and Kathy return. After a grisly jump scare, Andy attacks them. In one of the most vintage kills I've ever seen, Andy strangles Bob with the wire from the window speaker for the drive-in, while Kathy stands there doing her best Felissa Rose. Afterwards, Andy rips home in the family car, adding to his body count on the way. Kathy screams and runs out of the rest of the movie. Andy returns home to the protection of his mother, but not that of his father, as Charles holds him at gunpoint. Christine pleads with some strong points,
I don't care about Catherine!
and ultimately Charles can't bring himself to shoot his own son, despite how monstrous he's become. Christine leaves with Andy, but the Chekhov tax must still be paid. They leave the house, but the police have shown up. The officers take a few shots at Andy, one from range and one from point blank. He isn't fazed and gets back at the second officer for snipping the heads off of all those birds. The gunshots from the first officer, however, have, of course, set the car on fire. The first time they did this fire stunt, while taking the first turn, the wind sucked the fire from the trunk right into the backseat of the car and ignited the vinyl seating. There was a piece of safety glass between them and the fire, but the stunt driver had to talk Richard Backus down as the fire had frightened him immensely. The shot concluded and they stepped out of the car safely, but much to Backus's chagrin, Clark told them that there was too much fire, and they would have to perform the stunt again. Andy directs Christine to drive them to the cemetery, and they crash through the front gate, the only set that was actually built. Barely staying together, Andy limps his way to an open grave and collapses into it. He begins to bury himself as his mother whimpers. She notices the tombstone that he was writing on a few nights prior has his name carved into it. Sadly, she accepts her son's fate and begins to help bury him. The car explodes because, of course, and the film ends with Christine's words echoing its true message.
Andy's home. Some boys never come home.
Immediately following the production of Deathdream, much of the same crew packed their bags and flew up to Canada to start shooting the film Deranged, Confessions of a Necrophile. Deranged was also written by Alan Ormsby and would be co-directed by him. Bob Clark always claimed that it was too brutal for him, so he stepped back and produced. Clark would be about to direct a landmark movie of his own released the same year. In much the same way that Night of the Living Dead would change the genre, Bob Clark's Black Christmas would outline many of the tropes that would be popularized by John Carpenter's 1978 horror classic, Halloween. Clark would move to Canada and spend the majority of his career here. He earned dual citizenship, and just to hammer the point home a little more, in 1981 would direct Porky's, which would be Canada's highest grossing film for 24 years. After this quadrilogy of terror, starting with Children and finishing with Black Christmas, Clark left the horror genre, intending to not be pigeonholed as not only a horror director, but a horror director that could make it work on such a tight budget. He had planned to return to horror around the turn of the millennium, but that never came to fruition, and unfortunately, now never will, as Clark and his youngest son Ariel were both tragically killed in a head-on collision when a drunk driver jumped the median on the Pacific Coast Highway. Bob Clark was revered by his friends and peers, and his iconic films prove that they stand the test of time.
I was fond of Bob. I didn't have any problems with Bob. I mean, this is a man who was willing to sleep on your floor for as long as it took to get the movie done.
Bob was a quiet guy, but, you know, got things going. I mean, it was fun to watch him. And then, of course,
of what he allowed to stay on the screen, or what he allowed his actors to do or encouraged them to do. I think that's why his films endure, and why hopefully they will for another generation.
A remake of Deathdream was once in talks while the 2006 Black Christmas remake was in production, with Eli Roth rumored to be at the helm. The time appeared right, as the subject matter could likely be adapted to fit the state of the world at that time, but it never came about. That wouldn't stop Roth from commenting on the state of the world in his own way, however. With Black Christmas having been remade twice now, it's only a matter of time before Clark and Ormsby's previous work sees the light again, as Children and Deathdream can't stay buried forever. Until next time, I've been RJ, this has been Killer Canuck, and thanks for watching. Thanks for watching this episode of Canadian Horror History. If you liked what you saw, be sure to drop me a like and hit the subscribe button. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at RealKillerCanuck. If you like the tune playing in the background, be sure to check out Prodouji on SoundCloud and at noiserecords.com. Links in the description. Who's your favorite Canadian actor? I'm partial to Ryan Reynolds' beard in the Amityville remake. Until next time.